Imagine waking up one day to find your city split in half by a towering wall. How did this happen? In the aftermath of World War II, the world was dramatically reshaped, especially in Europe, where the geopolitical landscape was fraught with tension. The Allied powers, despite their united front against the Axis, were deeply divided on the vision for post-war reconstruction. These tensions were palpable as leaders from the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom convened at conferences in Yalta and Potsdam to decide the fate of a defeated Germany. At these pivotal meetings, it was agreed that Germany would be divided into occupation zones. Each of the Allied powers would control a portion, ostensibly to denazify, democratize, and rebuild. However, underlying these stated goals were deep-seated mistrust and ideological differences between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, despite being deep within the Soviet-controlled zone, was itself subdivided into 4 sectors due to its immense strategic importance. This special status made Berlin a microcosm of the global Cold War tensions. The city became the focal point of an ideological battleground, with the western sectors developing under capitalist influences and the eastern sector under communist control. This division set the stage for a city, and its people, caught in the throes of a burgeoning Cold War. It was not just a city split in geography, but in ideology, lifestyle, and allegiance. Thus began a stark division that would shape the city of Berlin for decades to come. With the city divided, 2 different worlds began to emerge within one Berlin. Initially, the division was marked not by a wall, but by barbed wire and a heavy presence of guards. These makeshift barriers sprang up overnight, slicing through streets, neighborhoods, and even families. East and West Berlin became terms that defined not just geography but a deep social chasm. Imagine the heartache of families split apart, parents separated from children, and lifelong friends now stranded on opposing sides of a burgeoning divide. In the East, the Soviet influence was palpable. The architecture began to reflect the utilitarian style favored by the Soviets, characterized by large, blocky structures that prioritized function over form. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of surveillance and control, as the Stasi, the East German secret police, kept a watchful eye on every aspect of daily life. Freedom of speech and political dissent were not on the menu, and the economy staggered under the weight of centralized control, leading to shortages and queues for basic goods. Contrast this with West Berlin, a city segment under the administration of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Here, the air buzzed with the promise of freedom and recovery. The Marshall Plan, which funneled aid into war-torn European nations, brought economic relief and sparked a period of rapid reconstruction. Billboards replaced bomb sites and consumer goods filled shop windows, symbolizing a burgeoning capitalist ethos. Cultural life flourished too, with music, art, and literature feeding the hungry minds of those craving distraction and normalcy. Yet, despite these stark differences, both sides faced their own struggles. In the West, freedom came with the constant threat of espionage and the psychological burden of living on the front line of the Cold War. In the East, the suppression of freedom was a trade-off many had to accept for social security and the promise of equality. As physical and ideological barriers hardened, so did life for Berliners on both sides. August 13, 1961, a date that changed Berlin forever. Under the cover of night, the city of Berlin was abruptly cleaved in two. As families slept, East German soldiers and construction workers began unrolling miles of barbed wire and erecting barricades across the city. By morning, a makeshift wall had materialized, slicing through streets, dividing neighborhoods, and splitting families who had no inkling that the night before would be the last time they could cross freely. The world woke to images of a city sundered by concrete and wire, sparking a flurry of international reactions. Governments from around the globe voiced their dismay and concern, yet the physical reality of the wall made any immediate intervention complex and fraught with the risk of escalating Cold War tensions. For the citizens of Berlin, the initial shock quickly gave way to a deep-seated dismay. East Berliners found themselves isolated from the western part of the city, many cut off from their jobs, loved ones, and a way of life they had known. Meanwhile, West Berlin became an island of democracy surrounded by a communist sea, embodying a stark contrast in ideologies. The wall itself was a daunting barrier, 12 feet high in some places, topped with barbed wire, and later fortified with watchtowers and anti-vehicle trenches. It wasn't merely a physical obstruction, but a palpable symbol of the Iron Curtain that had descended across Europe, dividing the East and West both ideologically and physically. The wall wasn't just concrete and barbed wire, it was a symbol of a world divided. Living in the shadow of the wall, everyday life in East and West Berlin diverged dramatically. On one side, the West thrived under a capitalist economy, buzzing with cultural vibrancy and relative freedom. Streets were lined with shops brimming with goods, and the air pulsed with the latest music from around the world. In contrast, East Berlin, under socialist rule, presented a starkly different scene. The shelves in stores were often sparse, and the atmosphere was weighed down by a palpable sense of surveillance and restriction. Freedom of movement was one of the most glaring disparities. West Berliners could travel almost anywhere, their passports welcomed across the globe. For East Berliners, travel was restricted, primarily confined within the Iron Curtain unless granted special permission, which was rarely given. This lack of freedom led many to dream of escape, dreams that sometimes culminated in daring, often dangerous attempts to cross the wall. These attempts were fraught with peril, and the penalties for being caught were severe. Stories abound of families torn apart, of midnight scrambles over barbed wire, and of tunnels dug in desperate hope. Each failed escape attempt was a testament to the harsh realities imposed by this concrete divider. Amidst this divided existence, espionage and political propaganda flourished. Both East and West engaged in a relentless war of ideologies. In the East, the Stasi kept an exhaustive watch over the population, quelling dissent and fostering a culture of fear and suspicion. In the West, broadcasts and leaflets aimed over the wall sought to undermine the socialist regime, offering glimpses of a different life. Despite the oppressive environment in the East and the constant threat of global escalation, the human spirit remained resilient. Art, literature, and underground music scenes thrived, often as forms of silent protest or simply as escapism from the oppressive reality. While the wall stood firm, the spirit of Berliners was far from broken. The physical and ideological divide only served to strengthen the resolve for freedom and unity, echoing in silent resistance and whispered hopes of a day when the wall would fall. Walls are built to be torn down, and in 1989, the unimaginable happened. The Berlin Wall, long a symbol of division and oppression, was poised for its dramatic downfall. As the 1980s progressed, the winds of change blew across the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced policies of glasnost and perestroika, signaling a new openness and restructuring that reverberated through the Eastern Bloc. East Germany, under the rigid leadership of Erich Honecker, initially resisted these changes. However, as economic stagnation worsened and public unrest grew, the pressure became unbearable. By late 1989, East Germany was a nation on the brink. The government, now led by a new regime under Egon Krenz, could no longer hold back the tide of demand for freedom and reform. Crucially, Hungary had already opened its borders, allowing East Germans a gateway to the West. This act set a domino effect in motion, culminating in mass protests throughout East Germany. Then came the night of November 9, 1989, a night that would be etched in history. In a press conference laden with confusion, an East German spokesman mistakenly announced immediate unrestricted passage through the Berlin Wall. Within hours, jubilant crowds swarmed the barrier. East and West Berliners, armed with nothing but hammers and picks, began to dismantle the very structure that had divided them. The breach of the wall was more than a physical demolition, it was the symbolic shattering of decades of Cold War tension. Yet the euphoria of that moment belied the complexity of the path ahead. The process of reunification was arduous and fraught with challenges. Economic disparities between the East and West had to be addressed, and a unified national identity had to be fostered. Berlin, once the epicenter of division, began to reinvent itself. Infrastructure was merged and modernized while social and economic policies were harmonized. The wall came down, but the journey to mend the city's divide was just beginning. From a city split in half to a bustling, unified metropolis. Today's Berlin is a dynamic blend of history and modernity, where traces of its divided past blend seamlessly with a vibrant present. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the city has undergone a remarkable transformation, emerging as a pivotal cultural and economic hub in Europe. In the heart of the city, where once stood a concrete divider, there now lie sprawling parks and lively streets that host festivals celebrating both halves of its history. Efforts to integrate culturally and socially have been profound, knitting together a city that once lay fragmented. Schools, museums, and public spaces now serve as platforms for dialogue and reconciliation. Yet, the scars of division linger subtly in the collective memory of its people, serving as poignant reminders of the past. Despite these remnants, Berliners have built a resilient community, one that thrives on diversity and unity. Berlin stands today not just as a city but as a testament to the enduring human spirit to overcome division.